Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and here I talk about all things tea. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to subscribe to follow more of what I do. Today I'm sharing another historical tea session, this time looking at a woman who is associated with one of the first accounts of tea in England. No, we're not talking about Catherine of Braganza. Today we're having tea with Elizabeth Pepys. Now, popular wisdom has it that tea was introduced to England by Catherine of Braganza, who brought it with her as part of her dowry for her marriage to Charles II in 1662. However, it's pretty certain that tea existed in Britain before then, and in fact, Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, has an entry in 1660, 2 years before Catherine of Braganza came to England, where he described drinking a cup of tea in a public house with a friend. He didn't seem to enjoy it that much, but later on he talks about his wife, Elizabeth, drinking tea because it was prescribed to her by her apothecary or her doctor or pharmacist. Now, in the 17th century, tea was still very much a new thing in the Western world, having been brought over by traders who came from China, primarily from the Netherlands. And the 17th century saw the publication of Nicolaus Tulp's Medical Observations, in which he devotes the final chapter to a discussion of tea. Now, he supposedly worked for a tea importing company, so it is perhaps not surprising that he extolled its virtues as any number of curatives. So it was supposed to improve vigor, reduce weakness, it was good for headaches, it was good for stomach ailments, and tea was used medicinally among many classes in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. I mentioned in my Marie Antoinette video that it was used as a remedy against gout in 18th century France, although mainly by the wealthy. So I thought I would take a look at what Elizabeth Pepys' medicinal tea might have looked like. So the first thing I wanted to explore is what types of tea would have been available to Elizabeth Pepys in 17th century England. Now, it's pretty well known now that green tea was just as popular, if not more popular in some areas, than black tea. So it is likely that both black and green tea would have been available. So I wanted to look at 17th century green teas. And there were a few different kinds available, but some of the most common and easiest to export would have been gunpowder green tea and what was known as Hyson or Lucky Dragon green tea, which is now known as Chun Mai. So I have some dishes of these kinds of tea, and this is the gunpowder tea. It's very tightly rolled into little pellets that resemble gunpowder. And this is the Lucky Dragon, or Chun Mai or Hyson tea. It's these kind of twisted leaves that I think are thought to resemble dragon claws. And both of these teas are from Calabash Tea and Tonic in Washington, D.C. I was so excited to find the Lucky Dragon tea. So I happen to know that gunpowder green tea does not often agree with my stomach. So I've decided to brew the Lucky Dragon, or Hyson or Chun Mai tea, which is a bit of a more delicate green tea, and it's one that I'm reasonably certain I don't have any issues with. But don't worry, I do have plans to use the gunpowder green tea in the future for an upcoming video that I think you guys should stay tuned for. So make sure to subscribe so that you can catch that video in the future, probably next month. So now that we have our tea that we're going to use our Lucky Dragon tea, we have to take a look at how they would have brewed it. Now, in his medical observations, Tulp points out that Japan and China have two different methods of making tea. In Japan, they grind it to a powder and whisk it into hot water, whereas in China, they prepare it by boiling it. And this is a very interesting term, and for a long time, tea was described as a decoction in Western literature. And this was one that I actually decided to look up because In my modern herbal training, a decoction is almost exclusively used for roots and maybe very tough seeds, because what you do is you take the plant matter, you put it in water and you boil it, perhaps even until some of the water boils away. It's a way to extract flavor from a very tough piece of plant matter. And it's not really something that I think about doing to tea. So I read through the medical observations. My Latin is a little shaky, so I had to rely on Google Translate for a little bit of it, but I was able to gather that it seems like Tulp may have had some exposure to Lu Yu, because he describes the Chinese method of preparing tea, that they boil it with a little salt and then reheat it and serve it to guests. And this sounds a lot like an altered form of Lu Yu's boiled tea in the Tang Dynasty. And the verb he uses to describe what they do to the tea is decoccere, which means to boil down. So that is the ultimate root of the English word decoction, or to decoct something. So it is pretty apparent that, at least in the Netherlands in the 17th century, that tea was prepared by boiling the leaves in water. So what was a decoction, and what would an English person have thought a decoction was in the 17th century? For that, I went to Nicholas Culpeper, who is kind of the grandfather of English herbalism. He wrote The English Physician, which has also been transcribed under the name The Complete Herbal. In the 17th century, kind of the mid-17th century, he describes a whole array of plants, some possibly rather outdated uses of some of these plants. However, he has a long section on preparation methods. And in his preparation notes for syrups, he talks about how to make a decoction. And you take your plant matter, you boil it in water until half the water is consumed. So you're supposed to boil this plant matter for a long time. He does also describe infusion versus decoction for more delicate plant matter, but that seems mostly reserved for flowers, and it wasn't quite the case yet that they thought that decoction should only be used for roots. So we're going to make a decoction of green tea. So let's brew. So here we have our decoction of green tea. I used about a tablespoon of leaves to 2 cups of water, which comes from Nicholas Culpeper's instructions to use about a handful of herb for a pint of water. A tablespoon is about a handful. And I boiled this for about 20 minutes until I saw it starting to reduce. Oh, it's almost viscous looking as I pour it. That is some strong tea. So let's give this a taste. So I'm using my handleless teacup from Valley Brook Tea, the same one that I used for my Abigail Adams video, because again, in the 17th century, they would not have had handled teacups yet, and they would have drunk their tea from a dish or a cup without a handle. And now I will stop stalling. Maybe I can stall a little bit longer and smell it. Oh, that's interesting. It has a very vegetable-y scent to it. It's not as strong smelling as I thought it would be. It's probably because I've let it cool off a bit. Oh, that is so bitter. It's not horrible. You can get some nuance of flavor, but it is extremely bitter and medicinal. I'm also having this cup because it's small, and this would not have been drunk in large quantities. Tea was still rather expensive, and in fact, in the 17th century, England started taxing tea, so that would have made it even more expensive because it was a Dutch commodity. I could definitely see this being invigorating. I don't immediately feel like I'm going to be ill, like I have in the past when I've drunk other types of green tea too strong. Interestingly enough, eventually it was thought that green tea was actually not appropriate for people who were of delicate constitution, but I will talk a little bit more about that next week in next week's historical video, which is one that I have been looking forward to making for over a year. So definitely hit that notification bell so you can catch it too, because I'm really excited about this one. But this has been Tea with Elizabeth Pepys, or tea as a medicinal remedy in 17th century England, featuring Lucky Dragon green tea from Calabash Tea and Tonic. And I will take a moment to say this is a lovely green tea, and I have had it steeped in a proper modern fashion, and I really enjoy it. So I'm actually not surprised that it's not completely horrible, but I would not recommend boiling your tea for 20 minutes in general. There are some kinds of tea that I will boil. So thank you for joining me for this historical tea session, and I hope I see you again sometime. Bye.